authority on long in history fossil fuel use. So those countries have the possibility to act compared to countries which have developed more recently and countries which have developed much less. So that's looking at the back. And that can be controversial. The US in particular rejects, at least the US negotiators reject the historical view of justice. It's fair to say the US Congress does too. A conception of justice which is much more amenable to, in particular, emphasizes fairness in terms of trade. So the US negotiators often argue that we should look forward rather than back, and that in looking forward, the US should not disadvantage itself by taking on burdens that its competitors, such as China, do not have to also take on. So that is a conception of justice, a partial conception of justice. Intergenerational justice, this is something which has been present philosophers rather than general actors that concerns justice towards future generations as we get more. Although it's fair to say that there is such a coherent thing as intergenerational justice. But that says more about the decadence of moral philosophy as a discipline rather than anything which should have any real world traction. Ecological justice, that was raised in a question just now. This attempts to take a non-anthropocentric, much more biocentric view of justice and would incorporate the non-human world as containing subjects of justice as well, be they ecosystems, species, individual creatures. So that's ecological justice. And then accompanying all of these conceptions of justice, there are, especially ones that emphasize individuals, such as cosmopolitan justice, there are all kinds of accounts of specific rights and needs that can be claimed, that can be met, that should be met, but are often denied in a climate context. I can't skate over the details of those at the moment. Okay, what happens when these conceptions of justice enter the real world of climate politics and global climate politics in particular? Some of them fare better than others. If a particular conception of justice can be attached to the material interest of some key actor or actors in the system, then that conception of justice is likely to fare relatively well. And so I've already suggested that fairness in the terms of trade as a conception of justice is attached quite easily to the US negotiating position. The idea of historical justice is also international. Nations as unit of analysis is also been is also very consistent with the position taken by the G77 group of developing countries plus China in their negotiating position, that they've argued that as a matter of historical justice, the burden of action should fall on the wealthier developed states. Justice also encounters discourses. A discourse, it's possible to understand the global politics of climate change, not just in terms of interests, competing interests and how they fare in negotiations, but also in terms of discourses. Discourse is a shared means of making sense of the world, enabling the assemblage of bits of information into coherent accounts. That's a bit of a mouthful. But the world of global governance, well, actually governance in general, is often largely composed of competing discourses. Examples might include sustainable development, the dominant global discourse of environmental concern over the last 30-odd years. Market liberalism, or neoliberalism, which is the dominant discourse of the global financial system. And these have power that don't necessarily reduce to the material interests of actors. And sometimes discourses can actually help create material interests because they give actors a sense of what their interests are. Okay, product placement. In this book, which is published this year, we actually do try to map the constellation of discourses surrounding global climate governance. What we don't do, and in retrospect what we could have done, was try to map conceptions of justice, climate justice, onto this constellation of discourses. So thinking about this talk, I made a start of that one. I also realised just what a lot of work there is to be done, that needs to be done on that. Sometimes there isn't much mapping. Some of the discourses that are prominent in global climate governance pretty much ignore justice. So examples of that would be ecological mobilisation. That's a very sort of technological approach to things. Sees clean technology allied to capitalism as promoting both economic growth and mitigation of global emissions. Climate marketisation, again, a discourse becoming increasingly prominent in terms of emissions trading schemes, carbon offset schemes. Climate go very different direction. The old discourse of the limits of growth to 1990s, with the more recent discourse of planetary boundaries, doesn't really have much to say about justice. So in some discourses, justice doesn't register. In other discourses, we can find conceptions of justice. So ecological justice and basic needs we find in a discourse of green radicalism, which is at the margins of the official negotiations and much more prominent in civil society activity surrounding the global governance of climate change. We find international justice some cosmopolitan recognition of basic needs in a discourse that we described as expansive sustainability. But this is a discourse that actually exists somewhat on the margins of civil society gatherings, to a degree in both business gatherings and social movement gatherings, but its presence is somewhat marginal. I should also note that the discourse of denial of climate change can itself appeal to the conception of justice. It wouldn't be called a conception of climate justice, but a libertarian view of justice, as set out by, quite famously by the philosopher Robert Nozick, for example, does meet the formal requirements of a theory. It's about the allocation of benefits and burdens in society and be applied to global as well. It's very individualistic. It's one which does not accept any active role for government, which believes very strongly in private property and exchange in markets. But it is a conception of justice, even though, as I say, in the realm of climate justice, it's not usually recognised as such. And some conceptions of justice find weaker presence in any of the discourses that we find surrounding the global of climate change. So I think cosmopolitan and intergenerational justice now, having emphasised justice as central to climate ethics, I'm now going to suggest that justice is actually not the whole story when it comes to the ethical dimensions of climate change. John Rawls was the most important political philosopher of the 20th century, famously began his classic book, The Theory of Justice, by asserting that justice is the first virtue of social institutions. So that should be the first goal of all social institutions, according to Rawls. I'm not sure that repeated in a very good book on climate change called Atmospheric Justice by Steve van der Heijden, published a few years ago. He appealed to Rawls in saying why he focused first and foremost on justice in the context of climate change. I think that claim is actually becomes harder to sustain if indeed we have entered what Will Steffen and others have called the Anthropocene, an era of human-induced instability in the Earth system. So in this light, John Rawls is not necessarily just the most important philosopher within the 20th century. We can also categorise him as a late Holocene philosopher. In the Anthropocene, I would argue that the core problem of social institutions is not injustice as such. The core problem in those social institutions is their path dependency, their capacity to perpetuate themselves into a different sort of era, but in a way that allows them to generate feedbacks which avoid the ecological dimensions of that era. We can think of, for example, markets generate feedback loops, avoiding ecological systems. We can think of the institutions of global finance, which position themselves as too big to fail. So they encounter a global financial crisis in 2008, and they emerge afterwards in pretty much the same form as that which led to the crisis. They've established a very strong degree of path dependency, which enables them to survive crisis, but not in a way that would prevent future crisis. Even something like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has arguably secured a degree of path dependency. Especially the activities of lots of civil society actors and global social movements, even though it doesn't seem to be producing very much, or at least not enough to actually meet the challenge it was set up to meet. Yet nonetheless, it remains the focus of these sorts of efforts. It has developed a lot of actors who just have a stake in its routines, who show up every year at its proceedings, despite the fact that there could conceivably be other locations in the global system where their efforts might be better spent. And the UNFCCC seems unable to reform its practices in the light of its manifest failures, such as, for example, the need in its proceedings to secure something like unanimity, the ability to of any of the parties to object to any clause, any proposed agreement, and dealt with. That must be somehow talked out, somehow sort of talked through and recognised in draft texts. So I think it's widely recognised that often leads to generally leads to a lot of impasse. But nevertheless, the institution itself moves on, or rather, it moves on. It doesn't really change itself. It remains largely unchanged in the way it works. The opposite to path dependency can be called reflexivity, the capacity to be something different, not just to do something different. And that's, I think, something we do not currently observe in the UNFCCC. It doesn't seem to be able to generate the antidote to problematic path dependence. But it's not just reflexivity that matters in the Anthropocene. It's something that it's reflexivity with an ecosystemic dimension, which also involves listening more effectively to the Earth system, the signals emanating from it, the ability to seek, receive, and respond to early warnings about potential ecological state shifts, and the capacity to question for values such as justice in this light. So, in other words, justice is not just something to be asserted and pursued. It's something that needs to be deliberated. At the outset, I set out a number of different conceptions of climate justice. I think it's by no means obvious which of those should prevail. Should it be international versus cosmopolitan? I would lean towards cosmopolitan. I can see the arguments for international. So there are a number of questions of justice which will lead us, lead us in different directions. But justice itself, as I say, is not just something that should be asserted and then pursued. It's something that continually needs to be deliberated in reflexive fashion. So I'll finish that.
Parties involved and then published on the Climate Change Institute website.